blonde as the blinding sun, blue eyes twinkling like the morning star. It seemed like heaven. She came to kill him. Who sent her? The girl definitely hadn't met him before. But then why was she getting such a familiar feeling? The protagonist had no idea what she was talking about. What an impertinence that was. He gave her an incentive. If the stranger told the truth, he would show mercy and kill her with a single stab. A dagger with an intricate pattern never seen in real life. And the color of the gems embedded in the dagger. Perhaps it was Kyle. The man wondered why she was asking that. Could it be that the girl was hiding here? The heroine abruptly jumped up and exclaimed that she recognized that eagle, no, red hawk, the Vilfian. The symbol of the imperial family. She had imagined it just like that. Though no, it turned out even better. The stranger felt like a hawk about to soar to the heavens. The guy was nervous because of her strange behavior and sudden movements. She could get a dagger in her head. Blood spurted out. She was wounded. And when she looked in the mirror, she saw a pretty girl. Didn't the heroine recognize herself? Gradually, everything began to darken. And she suddenly became dizzy. It was from happiness. Now she was lying happily on white sheets with an open wound. The man noticed how the stranger laughed before she lost consciousness. 6 months ago, the girl, without hesitation, began reading the novel Kingmaker. A distant land, the Empire of Vilton. A country where only the owners of red eyes could rule. The emperor had several princes, and misfortune, one by one, fell upon the princes who did not have red eye. Murder was committed, mysterious accidents, many children died. Except the sovereign didn't even blink an eye, because they didn't have those eyes. Then one day the fourth prince Isaac, who was thought to be missing, returned and did the impossible. He ascended to the throne as the dark-eyed emperor. It was like a fairy tale. And it came down to the main character. Morale stats plus luck. The protagonist went through all sorts of trials. But in the end, he is a character with a guaranteed happy ending. For such a thing, there was bound to be a secondary character who could never be happy. The first prince of the empire, blue-eyed Kyle de Vilfian, who tolerated the cruel attitude of a mother who longed to make her son emperor. He strived to be recognized as the crown prince. But nevertheless, a sad fate awaited him on the battlefield where there was no chance of victory. The girl did not wish such an ending for her favorite character. As far as she knew, people had 3 rights: freedom, equality, and love. And everyone was worthy of those rights. No one loved Kyle de Vilfian as he was, and when a guy became useless, they got rid of him. Even though he was a minor character, it was so unfair. So the heroine wanted him to love her. After all, she could make him happy. The girl's name was Kim Jungja. As always, she had worked overtime, finishing late at night, and now she was dragging her exhausted body home. But she was stopped by a truck that was speeding down the road. In fact, she had experienced something similar to being hit by a truck a long time ago. It happened when she was in a completely broken state because of a minor character in a novel. His name was Kyle de Vilfian, the first prince from the novel The Grey Cardinal. Kyle was a character who died a tragic death. He was not happy and absolutely uselessly fell into oblivion after 3 volumes, and not a single living soul mourned his death. Her first emotion after such a death was absolute emptiness. She thought it would be easier if she talked to someone about Kyla. Hence the decision was made to search for various blogs on this novel. But the search didn't yield any results, and even where mangakas have been having a lot of conversations about their work lately, the novel author's personal account didn't have a single line about her favorite character Kyle. The blatant unfairness enraged her, angrily repeating, "So if it's not the main character, it's not worth talking about at all." Dear writing, I miss Kyle madly. If this was the way it was meant to be, then why do you have to spell out his appearance and character in such detail? Kyle, who only exists on paper. She wanted to love him for longer than 3 volumes. There is no fever stronger than love fever. She reread the novel a huge number of times looking for the smallest details about him. To her, Kyle was like a breath of fresh air, and the novel itself was a Bible. It was natural for her to die and meet him in heaven. A loud and beautiful voice sounded in the girl's ears, saying with a touch of tiredness, "Awake?" Apparently the girl had fainted briefly, noticing a figure across from her very similar in description to. Was it really Kyle? Why was she tied up? Why did he tie her up? Was she that suspicious? What was she even doing in Kyle's room? She was lying on the bed Kyle himself was resting in. Kyle said in a menacing voice, "You hiding late at night in my bedroom? You are a very suspicious person. I had to take measures to make sure you don't try to kill yourself again before you reveal your identity. Could a girl who woke up tied up do that? Kyle bandaged her wound. Shoot her up. Even though she looks tough, she knows that Kyle is actually a good-natured little canary. The girl wants to keep the canary in a cage and only feed it goodies. Kyle asks one last time who she is. The girl Kim Time-ja decides to go for broke and tell the truth even if he doesn't believe it. But Kyle stares at her with a frown and demands to know where she is from. Kim Time-ja, worried only that his frown would give him wrinkles, blurted out that she was from Seoul, the capital of the Republic of Korea, and her name was Kim Time-ja, breathlessly waiting for him to say her name with his beautiful lips and velvet voice. But he said Kim Jin-ja. What a strange name. For Kim Time-ja, it was a blow. She asked him to say Kim Time-ja again. Kyle tried to say it, but all he got was Kim Jin-ja, Ki K-in-ja. It was very painful for the girl to hear. Kyle can't pronounce her name. Through trying to pronounce the name, he remembered that she said something about a canary. Kyle's guard bursts into the room worried. He was told by the servants that they heard a loud noise upstairs. But the first thing he saw was his master standing with the girl with his hands tied. Kim Time-ja immediately remembered Kyle's right hand, Banji. Kyle pointed at the girl and said it was that thief girl maybe trying to make an assassination attempt on him since he found her in his bed in the middle of the night. Banji bared his blade and pointed it at the girl. No one dares to even talk to his lord. And here she was sneaking into his bed right away. Kim Time-ja shouted that she is not a murderer at all, but just a person who loves Kyle a lot. Kyle was surprised. A girl who woke up in his bed because she loves him is something new. Came to kill and now she says she likes him. Kim Time-ja just can't stop looking at him. Did the heavens themselves give him to her? While the girl is flying in love fantasies, Kyle ordered to put the blade away. He was curious what this girl was carrying. So shameless is she? Kim just nods. She clearly has no manners or upbringing since she keeps calling the prince by his name. Banji doesn't understand what the prince is saying. Kyle repeats that Kim Jin-ja said he loves him. But Banji didn't hear that. Now the prince doesn't understand. Banji assumed that the prince is too shocked by the appearance of the assassin, and that's why he's hallucinating now. Kim Tum-ja thought that Kyle could hear her thoughts. Suddenly Kyle, with a flushed face, started repeating what Kim was thinking a few minutes ago. Can he hear all thoughts? Kyle was beginning to think he was having an auditory hallucination, and it made him feel insanely embarrassed. Was it really telepathy? Kyle could literally hear her every thought. What a useless superpower. The prince was in a panic, and she wanted to comfort him. Someone had said that the girl might have used some kind of dangerous spell. Now she was staring at His Highness with a look so evil it gave her goosebumps. Except it was a message of love. Kyle didn't understand what was going on. So he asked Banji to see if there was anyone in the imperial palace who knew Kim Kinju. The man understood the task and promised to make inquiries not only in the imperial palace, but also in the guild. The protagonist insisted that the man take her hair because it had an unusual color. Benji wondered if the prince could handle being alone with this woman. A positive answer was heard, albeit an unsure one. The girl liked everything where he was portrayed and used. It puzzled him. But Kyle still thought it would be okay. Suddenly, the stranger was called out by the prince's aide and warned that if she did anything disrespectful to him, she would die at his hands. The heroine was mentally annoyed with Benji because even the topic of death was not brought up properly. The guy offered to throw her in the dungeon right away, but she managed to stub his heel on her toe, causing him to scream in pain. He was worried that the stranger had broken his bone. Just because of that, Kyle de Viltien should not have been left with this man. The prince asked him not to worry him and to leave soon. He would be careful not to get too close like Benji. Kyle and the girl sat across from each other, and both of them were nervous. She couldn't accept that he could hear her thoughts. Besides, the heroine had been thinking about everything since then. An hour ago, the man was also trying to calm down because he couldn't handle the endless stream of her thoughts. Even Benji thought that she had cast a spell on him, so he thought that if they moved away from her, it would help. The girl, on the other hand, happily made the assumption out loud that she was a pure soul and had a sincere heart. Two pairs of wild looks fell upon her, which confused her. In fact, the stranger herself did not know the reason. She couldn't believe that Kyle had heard all of her thoughts, which meant there were certain categories. She mumbled this aloud, causing the prince to grow thoughtful. Benji demanded that she explain on what basis the heroine had said it. You could kill a man with that look. She was a little embarrassed, but she couldn't help it. If all her thoughts were heard, the girl would die instantly for stalking royalty. At this point, both men were thrown into shock. Kyle's surprised face was so cute too, and Benji exclaimed for the prince to look at the expression on her facial expression, which spoke of a ripe, treacherous idea that came into her head. Because of this, the heroine decided to watch her movements now. She now noted how much her arms hurt, so she had to ask for the rope to be loosened a bit, especially since she had no weapons. Kyle de Vilthian gave his consent, but before that, there was something that had to be checked. Then they looked to see how far her thoughts had progressed. There was no progress, so now she didn't believe she would even be released today. On Kim Tae-jae's appearance, the dazzling prince who clearly had the best looks in the world had fallen. It was a shame she didn't have a camera at the moment, because she was going to have to memorize that image of Kyle forever. Mentally, the girl demanded that someone call the court painter immediately and have him capture this beauty. She wanted to sit on Kyle's eyelashes, especially when he kept his eyes closed. It was already too much for him, honestly. When the prince turned around, Kim Tae-jae took a look at our backdrop, and she definitely liked the view. She called the man God because his looks were simply divine. He asked her to stop, and she in turn exclaimed that when the guy sneezes in the future, he'll be shouted, "Bless you," 10 times each. If looking good was a sin, then Kyle was awarded a posthumous execution. Kim Jin-jae stopped. The heroine was embarrassed because the prince had heard too much. Moreover, her interlocutor didn't even know what a posthumous execution was. She replied that it was considered one of the historical dramas. The body of a dead criminal was dug out of the ground and beheaded. Now he regretted asking at all. The man decided to make sure that his interlocutor was really saying that, in her eyes, she looked like a murderer. After all, just now, King Ginja had said it, and it sounded like he deserved it. The strange girl continued to deny her own words, just as suddenly, someone knocked on the door, so violently that it shook. Time was up. She didn't realize what she was supposed to do, since now she was going to be thrown into the dungeon. There was still so much more she wanted to tell Kyle, but he was no longer in the story. The front door continued to be tugged incessantly, and King Ginjae was nervous because she didn't know. It could have been Benji, who had probably even brought the guards with him. In her head, the man was telling them that His Highness had gotten into danger. There was a witch in his bedroom, and now they were going to take the culprit away, then burn her. How many times had she been dealt the death card? Of course, the girl didn't want to die again. The first time the cause of death was a car accident. The second time she was burned. The protagonist watched her until he opened the door and saw the maid. The maid alerted His Highness that Princess Sienna had invited him to breakfast, but mentally she thought she heard someone else's voice. The man abruptly grabbed the left side of his chest and repeated her words to himself. He gave an affirmative answer, but asked for some time. The maid understood, and with his permission, she bowed out. At this moment, Kim Jin-jae was hiding behind the door next to the prince. She thanked him, for she had stayed alive. The person who had interrupted them had already left. Blondlin elosted his dagger and scared the poor girl with it. She asked him to stop. If he did wish to kill her, then why had he hidden the cold weapon until then? When Ko pulled his hand towards her, she screamed at the top of her voice and tried to dodge, covering her eyes. A severed rope showed on the floor. She had been freed. The prince had only done this because he had promised to untie her after the test. Only now she had no blood flowing to her hands, which made her start to shake. The protagonist began kneading her hands, asking her to show them. From their faces came closer together. A thought went through her mind that Kyle was truly an angel. Only it was stressing him out, however. She was already about to seduce him. The prince was embarrassed when his new mate thought of strange things. The man hurt her again, and because of that she couldn't understand. Suddenly he could do it when the girl called his name. Kyle, with the look on her face, would know what she was thinking from now on. She didn't believe it was possible to control facial expressions just by looking at the prince's beauty, so she had to be careful. She repeated it mentally several times until Kyle de Vilthian mumbled that he was going to change his clothes. King Ginja admiringly asked him to finish soon. Even though she wished she could see his back, she pictured him embarrassed, which was probably why the man shouted demandingly for her to turn away right now. The heroine whirled around and cheerfully agreed, for her interlocutor was shy and cute at the same time. Just at that moment, her hungry stomach made itself known. She asked if the prince could invite her to breakfast. The answer was no. because only members of the imperial family would be there. Qin Jinjia was jealous. She wanted to go to the royal breakfast too, so she wondered if the hotel had a buffet. Suddenly something caught her attention. The protagonist was sure it was the maid, the girl who reported Princess Sienna. What about Kyle's reaction? It seems to be that conversation at breakfast, exactly the one with Sienna, the third princess of the empire. She always said that the throne belonged to her brother, Prince Jiran, and if anyone wanted to get in the way, they would suffer mercilessly. The black-eyed prince, who would appear a little later, was also the villain in the novel, who would be attempted to be killed. What was considered most unforgivable? Princess Sienna completely ignored Kyle and played with his food. Sometimes, even his side dishes had a slight poison in them. Every time he attended breakfast, he would vomit for days. An intolerable man. To prevent this from happening again, the protagonist needed to warn Kyle, but it turned out to be a force majeure. One awkward move, and they were both as red as tomatoes. He told her not to look back, hadn't he? She was sorry, of course, but she certainly didn't mind. Light music that was relaxing. The girl with the red eyes made everything perfect. Kyle was so handsome, and it was indescribable. It was enough for him to just breathe, and King Ginja had already managed to heal. A dark aura followed, from which it was as if someone was watching. It was the female protagonist who was watching her admirer in love, and he was clearly getting bored of it. He called out to her and said aloud that he had heard everything. The girl was beyond being someone who just looked at faces. That was the point. She better be able to read his mind. She was annoyed by such a maddening power. However, she was still curious as to why he never spoke to her. The man hadn't even called the guards, which suggested that he had no intention of putting the suspect in jail and keeping an eye on her. As it turned out, because of her past, even though the prince didn't know where Seoul was, the Viltian Empire had its own laws. They couldn't imprison unknown people for no reason, and they couldn't imprison innocent people either. Qin Jinjia thought about the fact that the novel Creator of Kings didn't mention anything about this. Maybe she was a bit biased towards this medieval age. The last word alerted Kyle. Now it was all lined up in her head. It certainly couldn't be considered a crime. The fact that she'd sneaked into his bedroom without any weapons. As it turned out, from the prince's own words, he was the one who had harmed her. If the protagonist were a wizard or wizards, she would have killed both him and Benji. Moreover, based on what she heard, he didn't have any malicious intent. A real angel. From his face to his personality, everything was perfect. Kyle was a mega sex bomb. Then again, he had heard it again. The guy tried to calm down anyway. He didn't think the girl was a danger. Just passed a little. Lucky for her. That was all he thought. Except this wasn't a dream. Qin Jinjia was obsessed with the name Kyle. That's why she kept thinking of him. If the heroine had already gotten into the Kingmaker novel, she was sure to have an excess of time. Before the prince would face a horrible death, however, would she be able to change what was destined to happen? The man had to go now, but he promised to return soon, and the girl was to sit obediently and wait for him. She called out to him and asked him to wait, trying to make sure that today's breakfast would only be a royal feast. If so, in that case, he was obligated not to eat. Nothing. The girl said aloud that when he came back from breakfast, his mouth would dry up and his stomach would cramp, and then he would vomit, which would last for days. Her words had surprised Kyle greatly. She was now very angry and exclaimed that it was Sienna's fault. The prince didn't know what she thought of the royal family, but at this point, the girl had gone too far. What Qin Jinjia said was considered so disrespectful that it could result in an immediate beheading. The protagonist noted when he got serious. He looked even cooler. His behavior spurred her to use respectful treatment of Princess Sienna. But because of Kyle, she couldn't do anything because she had to follow the novel. After a while, the character Isaac will enter the palace and help a man to uncover Sienna's plot. But even if it was just for one day, Qin Jinjia didn't want him to suffer. She had the urge to make him trust. Out loud, the girl tried to convince him that the princess had indeed done something to his food. Even if it was something minor, he always felt sick after eating. So she warned him not to touch the vegetables. The man wondered how she knew all this. After all, she said she wasn't a spy. Now, he might have thought she was suspicious. And also, once Kyle realized that Sienna was tricking him. But he kept ignoring it. At some point, the prince realized that Sienna was up to something. So Qin Jinjia didn't know what reason he had for belittling himself like that. She had told him not to be so handsome. Her gentle, innocent, and charming Kyle. He was considered a national treasure, so she wanted to protect him for the rest of her life. If his health was weakened by the poison, his face would fade too. There had to be a way to stop all this. Her appearance seemed to have destroyed any chance of another prince coming to Kyle's aid. No problem. There were other reasons besides wanting to be friends with these two. If the protagonist remembered correctly, she had time before the black-eyed Prince Isaac appeared. She made a pleading face, and he exhaled heavily because he couldn't be sincere when she talked about things like clean, polite, or charming. Now the girl was cursing herself for those dirty thoughts. But it was too late, and it was time for him to go. He was going to come back and ask how his new acquaintance knew that vegetables were the problem. Bottom line, ambiguous charm and nobility. Did she really scream that in her heart? Come to think of it, the protagonist was in her favorite character's room. She wanted to look into every nook and cranny, but Banji, walking through the corridors of the palace, was cursing the infernal woman because she had kicked him so hard that he still felt the pain. The man questioned the many guests there, but the silver-haired girl wasn't there. Suddenly, a sharp cry was heard coming from His Highness Kyle's room. At this time, breakfast was being served. Someone said that the prince's face didn't look good, so he might be in pain, except that the boy said he was a little sleep-deprived. It was his mother, Empress Regent Priscilla de Vilfian. Another character decided to put in his word. If the prince was sick, he didn't have to go anywhere. Just give an hour's notice. The red-eyed guy apologized insincerely, since he was the reason he had such a hard time getting here. The second prince of the Heron Empire, he shouldn't have come. The protagonist was very angry, but as it was, today was his brother's birthday, so he didn't want to miss it. The girl next to him agreed, because if it wasn't for such an event, it would have been hard to meet. Pora was so glad he was here. Kyle looked wonderful in her opinion, especially those blue eyes like water in a lake. This was the third princess of the Sienna Empire. The man made the assumption that she was bored, since she attacked him with such tedious words. His sister emphasized that he didn't have red eyes, so it was ridiculous to call him a great prince. Kyle felt like he was watching a play. Sienna was like a dog. Qin Jinjia, on the other hand, was completely different from the others. It was normal for the main character to get sick a few days after eating with them. His esophagus would rupture, but his mouth would ache every time. But His Highness was afraid to refuse them as he didn't want various rumors to spread. He remembered the girl's words about not eating vegetables. Heron snickered, clarifying why his brother had no appetite, citing an upset stomach. The man looked at the food again, and it was as if Sienna had guessed. Kyle didn't know if it was because of insomnia like that, but he just didn't seem to have an appetite. So the protagonist apologized for his rudeness, adding that he would send the gift to Herson separately. The princess began to defiantly poke holes in a piece of meat with her fork, but His Highness did not feel sores in his mouth today. That woman knew about it from somewhere. On this sunny day, Kyle decided to practice with his sword. It lasted for a long time that he got tired quickly, probably because he couldn't sleep at night. All because of that girl. It looked like his schedule would have to be changed. His sister wondered why he tried so hard to practice every day and attend every class. It didn't matter how hard he worked. He would still be just a blue star of Vilfian. The girl was called out by another, and Sienna played dumb, referring to the fact that she just suddenly thought it was fun from her brother's efforts. Though the imperial family was called the Son of Vilfian, the prince was nicknamed the Blue Star. The heroines were so surprised, of course, joyfully, but the princess mentally definitely did not share their point of view. Aloud, she asked the opinions of others regarding the fact that the sun and stars could not coexist together. Even though it wasn't really that important, underneath such a stellar nickname was the fact that it would never rise in the power of the imperial family. Princess Sienna said goodbye. She was angry as she wanted to understand the reason. At this time, the main character was leisurely walking in his own direction. He was extremely tired after the training session, noticing that he couldn't concentrate on the next session either. Not a sound had been heard all morning, so the prince thought that Qin Jinjia was just sitting silently. Benji couldn't believe his eyes when His Highness returned. The latter in turn inquired if he had managed to find out anything about Qin Jinjia. He was informed that no one in the palace had seen the girl with gray hair, but after all, she was so conspicuous. Didn't even the mercenaries of the guild know anything? Banji asked the informant. No one had ever met a gray-haired mercenary. so no one in the capital hired her. I wonder what Kim Jin-jae was doing right now. A few hours earlier, when he heard the scream, Benji had frozen in a stupor for a while. The girl had covered her head with a pillow. The character thought it was a murder scene, so he rushed towards her to interfere. As it turned out, Kim Jin-jae was enjoying the scent of His Highness. She had been admiring his portrait and drooling all day, and the girl had also been sitting on his chair for a very long time. Kyle asked him to stop, as that was enough already, and really, these were the kind of people he hadn't encountered before. At this time, the protagonist took off the bandage and made sure that the bleeding on her neck had stopped. As real as the sore was, the front didn't hurt at all. She decided now that she had managed to reincarnate after death, or else it was a disease. It didn't matter now though, since Kyle was right next to her. She would manage somehow. Suddenly, Kim Jin-jae was called out. It was the prince. Mentally, the girl praised him again. Looking at such a beautiful man, did it even matter if it was an illness or a resurrection? After all, her past life had only revolved around paying for utilities and rent and working overtime. She liked Kyle very, very much. The man noticed that she didn't know what shame was at all, because of how many times he asks her not to say his name. Kim Jin-jae quickly changed the topic, asking if breakfast was delicious. Thanks to her, his throat wasn't burning at all today. But pretty soon he was going to find out how she knew everything about him. He warned her not to even try to say anything stupid like she had fallen from heaven and knew everything and anything about everything. The protagonist liked the fact that she was compared to an angel. Ever since she was a little girl, princes have died mysterious deaths. True, Kyle didn't really want his new acquaintance to turn out to be a mercenary. But that wasn't true, after all. In any case, he had no reason to imprison Kim Jin-jae, but he couldn't let her go free either. And if they were in this situation, she should have been told how to act. The man offered her a job at the palace until he gave her back orders. She jumped up and squealed in delight or pleasure, because now she had a chance to see Kyle every day. She was enjoying everything so much that the guy had already just accepted it, and now she had to watch her thoughts carefully. Listening to this, Prince was going crazy. He asked Benji to look for a job in his palace for Kim Jin-jae. The girl followed him around, asking him questions. She was curious if Kyle always slept with a dagger in case someone killed him. Turns out that was true, because any spy could break in, like her. Kim Jin-jae felt sorry for her poor prince because he slept badly and was so tired. She was going to protect him for the rest of her days. Now the girl asked a question regarding his age, calling him Mr., which made Benji not very happy. The protagonist was afraid of his seriousness. Moreover, she had done him no wrong. If she were to call His Highness Miss Ahem by his first name, she would disturb his leisure time. He would hear her voice after all. Of course, the man agreed. After all, it could be an inconvenience. Kim Jin-jae noticed that her interlocutor looked away when he smiled. But he replied that His Highness turned 21 this year. He had graduated early from the academy and was constantly taking extra classes. Naturally, those who didn't understand anything called him a blue-eyed starlet and said that there was no way he could become an emperor. But Benji didn't think so, because there was no one else who cared about the empire as much as he did. She felt that way too, after all. The prince had lived for the empire right up until his death. But since she was here, that was definitely not going to happen. The man mumbled that it was the first time he had heard such a name. It was the first time he had heard a name so difficult to pronounce. So he assumed that the protagonist came from Plyland. Only how did she know about His Highness and him? Right now the prince was busy, so he decided to leave her alone for now. This kid was starting to get annoyed again. Kim Jin-jae decided that it would be better if she shut her mouth, except that in her opinion, Benji was still a good person. Her heart was beating so hard because she saw how he tried to do his best when it came to His Highness. Being in a very distant place, the girl had already learned about his loyalty and fortitude. Even more so, he was fond of praise. This girl, being in society and constantly working, had learned to be amusing and unobtrusive. Kim Jin-jae apologized at the writer of Grey Cardinal for complaining when the plot progressed very slowly because of many scenes like this. Benji blushed and said that it wasn't that hard. Once they found out who the stranger was, she could immediately go back to where she came from. As expected, he didn't ask anything more about her. In fact, even if he did ask, she had nothing to answer. Was there really only one way to go back? Though she didn't know if she was dead, she had been hit by a huge truck and her body had flown up by inertia. Shortly before falling, Kim Jin-ja lost consciousness and found herself in this place. Inside the novel Grey Cardinal. By the way, the prince was 21 years old. And if everything happened before the black-eyed prince returned to the palace, maybe she could buy time and strengthen Kyle's position. Only now the girl wouldn't let him live and die all alone. Someone called Madame Tully, the governess at the prince's palace. She asked what could be of use to Benji. Due to some circumstances, he was responsible for this girl, so he wanted to know if there was a job for her. The woman cheerfully added that she needed someone to clean His Highness's personal library. The one who had worked here before seemed to be returning to her homeland, going to become a farmer or something. When she was asked to introduce herself and Benji started talking, Kim Jin-ja slapped him because she didn't want to be called that here. She tried to think of an easy and cute name, until suddenly, the protagonist remembered a woman calling her Josephine. That's how the girl introduced herself, referring to the fact that she was a commoner, which means that she did not have a surname. As it turned out, Madame Tully also had a grandmother's name, so she considered it fate. Now it seemed that dog names sounded even more refined. The woman asked if Josephine could read. The heroine looked at the papers and gave a negative answer. Even Benji was surprised. In that case, Madame Maid didn't have a job for her. Therefore, King Ginzed exclaimed that she would come in handy where physical strength was required. After all, if she couldn't find a job here, she could be kicked out of the palace. If the girl went outside of it, she would have virtually no chance of meeting Kyle. Then would she be able to save him from the next attack? Tally had made it clear that she had no job for Josephine, only for men. Someone called out to Benji, asking him if there was an empty room somewhere and if there was a way to get clothes. The man didn't understand why Kim Jin-ja would ask that. The other one was serious about getting this job. Now, the red-haired man definitely thought she was a spy. But that wasn't the point. The protagonist had to make His Highness happy and be by his side. If there was no job available for the girl, then she could do men's work as well. Josephine made the decision to dress like a man. Even though it seemed like a successful plan to her, Benji clearly didn't agree with her. Men's work was either carrying huge buckets of water, or sawing trees in the garden, or having to carry suitcases to the wagons, all of which she understood. Kim Jin-ja hurried him to fetch the man's clothes before Benji suddenly stopped, because he noticed how she called him simply by his first name, a habit that annoyed him too much. Even though the girl had asked him not to exert himself, the man found only a shirt. The protagonist thanked him and started to consider it. No matter how much he thought about it, this idea seemed absolutely reckless to him. He was going to ask His Highness to think of something else. The girl didn't agree because it was impossible for this to be located outside of the palace. I will only be able to help him by being as close as possible. The situation began to slowly change. After all, Kyle, who was said to never smile, had smiled at her several times today. It seemed like she could somehow get him to smile more often. Kim Jin-ja asked Benji to trust her. Out of embarrassment, he even turned away, but discounted it all for a spell. The heroine inquired if anything was wrong, and then abruptly asked him for his knife. She wished to borrow it, but the guy refused because there was no way he could give it to someone who wasn't trained in the art of using it. Josephine then asked him to help cut something off, namely, her hair. It was sad, of course, since she had worked so hard on healthy hair care in that world. But in this one, it was Kyle she was suffering the most for. So there was nothing she couldn't do for his sake anyway. Her hair could grow back, so there wasn't much difference. Benji wasn't sure about that. Since he'd never done it, she couldn't wait any longer. So she rushed over and tried to forcefully grab the knife. Thoth exclaimed that a knight could never give his blade to someone. A while later, he was forced after all. King Gingjia asked him not to cut it all off at once, but to divide his hair into 3 parts and cut it to the right length. It'll be fine, even if it turns out a little crooked. That way, she'll go in for a real commoner. Benji said the color of her hair was like the Milky Way or water in a clear river. It was strange for her to hear that. He took one strand, but suddenly the girl screamed at the top of her voice. As it turned out, while talking, the guy had poked her with a knife. He had cut off her hair. It was a disaster. Benji apologized, but reasoned that Kim Jin-ja had twitched a lot. Thankfully, she wasn't hurt, but it was still hurtful. Sitting down once again, the protagonist showed where she should have cut now. The knight was afraid that the girl would take revenge on him, but that wouldn't happen, because to her it was just hair. And if she wanted to be near His Highness the Prince, it was nothing at all. Banji relaxed and agreed. No one could think deviously while watching someone he liked. The protagonist mumbled demandingly that her interlocutor was quick to make perverts out of people, and she kept on calling Banji by his first name. Then she was overreacting a lot. Moreover, the guy had already apologized for cutting her hair badly. So she should have tried not to do that in front of others. It wouldn't be good if someone heard a commoner calling an aristocrat by name. Of course, King Gingjia understood this. She would be more careful and considerate from now on. The man was unusually talkative. Could it be that this was his way of trying to relieve the tension? After a while, everything was ready. There was no mirror in this room, so she wouldn't be able to check what she looked like. So the protagonist asked Benji's opinion. The girl changed her clothes and used bandages, which helped a lot in the transfiguration. The knight allowed it. She noticed how much his face was flushed, so she was curious if he was hot. The man didn't answer and just walked out. Kin Jinja didn't understand what was going on with him. The main character was introduced as Josephine's younger twin brother. Madame Tully looked at her and didn't see the trick. She asked him to introduce himself. Now the girl had to make up a man's name too. Joe. Now her name was Joe, of course. There was nothing left for her to do but agree. The protagonist began to compose the story further. Apparently, her parents were pissed off that they had to make up names for both him and his little sister at the same time. Commoners are all like that. What's the big deal? The maid had been watching her for a long time, so Kin Jinja thought that she had been exposed. Suddenly, the woman brightened up. Starting tomorrow, Joe will be in charge of the stables, and he in turn promised to study hard when it didn't come to him. It's a stable. There used to be a guy who worked there, but he ran away because the work was too hard. Anyway, it would be great if Joe was put in charge of it from tomorrow. Now Mrs. Tully would make sure he didn't run away. There was a small servant's house next to the stables, so it would be better for the protagonist to spend the night there. These horses belonged to His Highness, so Joe had to watch them very carefully. If they fell ill or had any problems with them, he should have informed her right away. Of course, King Ginja had to take care of little things like if the horses didn't eat well or were in a bad mood. Since she also had a lot of business to take care of, it would be glorious if Joe faithfully performed her duties as a stable boy. Dumbfounded, the girl mumbled that she liked horses a lot. She agreed, at least it wasn't cleaning and polishing carriages, as she had originally assumed, but merely caring for horses. If the protagonist was going to work in a stable, she wouldn't have a uniform. They arrived at the location. Right now, Benji needed to go, so if anything happened, she needed to go to the royal barracks or the imperial palace chancery. And if suddenly King Gingjia didn't like the name Joe, she interrupted him, adding that he should only call her by that name when they were not alone. Other names might have aroused suspicion. Again, the boy turned away with a confused expression, walking away, asking her not to cause trouble. The knight had left her as well, and now it seemed she was truly on her own. The girl was going to make no mistakes and adjust to life in this world. Inside the stable, things turned out to be far from positive. Kin Jinja was terrified. She couldn't believe that she was in the imperial stables. And was this really the house she would be spending the night in? The horses weren't too happy about it either. The protagonist was setting herself up to tolerate it. It was all for the sake of His Highness, who looked like a rabbit or a vixen. Compared to when she was horribly overworked at their firm, it was all a trifle. The girl said hello to the horses and introduced herself as Joe. From now on, she would feed them and clean them here in the stable. Suddenly, the horse licked her cheek, as if he melted at her smile. Just like that, smiling sadly, King Gingjia began to live the daily life of an imperial stable keeper. She had now gotten to know the animals, which meant it was time to start gradually doing things. First of all, the fucking horse manure needed to be cleaned up. It was already sundown, so perhaps the protagonist should have done just that and gone to bed. Of course, even though she was in a novel, it smelled like reality. Maybe she needed a straw stuffed up her nose. Somewhere nearby, a dark silhouette appeared. The stranger approached and asked Joe who he was. The girl was not afraid. She said hello calmly and gave a false name, adding that she had been put in charge of the stables from today. The stranger didn't believe it. He began to circle her with his gaze, examining her from all sides. The stranger summarized. Joe didn't look like someone who could work at the stables. They were completely short-handed anyway, so this would be a great choice. His name was Rick. The man was the local gardener and a minor character. The old man suggested eating first, and the main character was just as hungry, except it applied to the horses. He pointed out that Joe always had to take care of the horses first. Even if they were sold, the proceeds wouldn't even be enough to pay for a horse's tail. That's how Rick trained her, occasionally throwing out sarcastic quips. For example, he exclaimed that the horses should have been fed first, then brush them every day. He didn't understand why Joe was so slow, even though he was young. Even if it was the first time, he still wasn't allowed to do anything. And after all, they said they would be thoroughly trained. Bullshit. The girl seemed to understand why the past employee had run away. She was literally bleeding from her ears and mouth when Rick turned me to her. She even had to learn the names of all the horses. After all, she wouldn't like it if someone called her name wrong. Only the girl had been called Kinjin Joy or Joe many times before. She was going to write it all down. Ben, Melinda, Rinji, Martin, Diep, and she was taking notes in Korean. Rick at this point called the situation disastrous. Tilly had apparently had a very hard time finding new employees lately. The old man slapped Joe and noted that it was evening, so they needed to go out to eat. One had to at least eat well. Otherwise, how was the guy going to work at full capacity? Even though Rick was rather harsh, but Kim Jurja seemed like he was a caring person. Not a bad person. But if this uncle got to her again, they would have to change the genre of this novel to a thriller. Night finally came, and the protagonist went to bed. Her dinner consisted of corn porridge and one potato. Sleeping in such a dilapidated shack was a bit difficult. If it weren't for mad love, she couldn't stand it. She said aloud that living anywhere was never easy, but still, how nice it was to be able to see the night sky from here. Looking up at the sparkling stars, she thought of Kyle, Viltian's blue star. After all, every day, Kim Jin-jo would read a novel around this time. Suddenly, she had the urge to send a message about what had happened to her. She abruptly got up from the bed and started remembering sweet, handsome Kyle. Even though she was Kim Jin-ja, she somehow didn't have the right pronunciation, so she wanted to be called that. Did the masterpiece created by the hands of the god himself, Kyle, hear her voice? She was in the stables, so he could safely come here in case he felt he missed her. Since he was most likely tired, the girl would stop sending him mental signals. King Ginjia wished him good dreams and said goodbye. Now she wondered if the message had reached its destination. After all, she couldn't check or see his reaction. If there was at least Benji around, that would be fine. Now that the message had been sent, she had to go to sleep. When she woke up, she didn't want to be in the real world. If this was a dream, she wasn't going to wake up. Kim Jinja wished everyone a good morning. Rinji, Melinda, Ben. She closed her nose and quietly began to clean up after the horses, while Rick watched contentedly behind her. Thank goodness it didn't turn out to be a dream, and she wasn't back in the real world. That was her job, so she wouldn't be stupid because she owed it to herself to try. Who knew? Maybe in time, Kyle would trust her. The main character would show him some Korean willpower. And just like that, 3 whole months went by. Neither Kyle nor Benji came to see her. Joe, the stable boy, continued to just slave away. Was this really the end? That's how this webtoon would end. As it turns out, Kim Jin-ja thought to herself that if this was a story about the prince visiting the stable boy, it was nonsense. Rick called out to Joe and asked him to stop suffering and go have lunch. This guy, from what he could tell, was doing well. Even his shoulders had grown wide. Well, what else could it be? A whole month passed. She was fully adjusted to working at the stables and her new name. Even though it was hard, she gradually began to enjoy the work. People in the palace began to treat her more friendly, and she quickly bonded with the other servants. The girl said hello to Max and made it clear that when Selma was caught, she wasn't going to let it go that easily. Joe was called over by another woman. As it turns out, Joe had a fight with Rick yesterday, and now they had come to have lunch together. Kim Jin-jo mumbled that since she's stuck here and Rick is her only friend, it's the same situation. How come the protagonist just happened to be so used to everything? The old man replied that he was just babysitting him, except Rick should have been more grateful for having a young and cool friend like him. Plus, no one even suspected that Joe was a girl. There was an upside to that. Doing his job every day, it was impossible not to pump up his muscles. Compared to before, Kim Jin-ja had grown taller and stronger, and it seems like she wasn't sending a message to Kyle today. The main character said hello to him mentally and pictured him still as beautiful. She wished he would visit her today. Of course, she realized that the prince was terribly busy, but still the girl missed him. In fact, she was even willing to go to Benji because she was bored with everything. Kyle just had to visit her. After all, Kim Jin-jo couldn't leave her place. Now she had an idea for an album of his pictures that she could admire. If the girl started to be lazy, she immediately remembered that His Highness would get angry and immediately fire her. That was the difference between the working class and the aristocracy. Kyle was her personal heroine. She was bored out of her mind. At this point, the man choked on his tea. His face took on a red hue once again. As it turned out, He could hear very well when his new acquaintance sobbed at how much she wanted to see him. But when Kim Jin-ja thought of him again, a smile appeared on her face. She was like the ultimate pea-jester. Kyle thought how crazy this lady was. Even though the girl was so far away from him, he could still hear her voice very clearly. There was no nightmare scarier than that. She was probably out there doing crazy dances, holding a rake in her hands and singing songs in praise of him. Kim Jin-ja howled about his golden hair when she had silver hair, so that meant their child would have something in between. The thought made the guy blush, making him look like a tomato. Mentally, he was ordering her to stop. Kyle had no idea what this lady was up to, so he imprisoned her in the emperor's castle and secretly watched, in case, if left alone, she might just be up to no good, or she might escape. There was even a surveillance report on Kim Jin-joy. The protagonist sang psalms while cleaning the stables, went on about the black horse being cranky and only eating fresh grass, had an argument with Rick on the way to breakfast, even hit him on the head and kicked him, escaping afterward. After eating, hurt herself with rice straw, went to collect hay in the backyard of the imperial palace, was able to bring an overflowing cart that seemed strong. Together with other workers, she pulled a wagon that was mired in mire. The last piece of information made the prince stand in a stupor. He put a watcher on Joe and had him followed, but in the end, he didn't find out anything useful. In all likelihood, she really wasn't a spy, however. Watching Kim Jin-ja every day, it seemed that the girl was incredibly stubborn, since no one had still never realized that she was a girl. Perhaps the protagonist was some kind of incredible professional. Once again, her thoughts were heard as Kim Jin-ja said hello and mumbled that there was no one else who suited her golden hair color as well as her Kyle. She wanted to die in his arms. It was very noisy again today. It seemed the girl was protesting that he hadn't come. The man asked for a pen and ink, which in a moment appeared nearby. The character carried the letter and tried to figure out which way the stable was. The prince ordered it to be delivered to Joe, who worked there. If he said the letter was from him, the guy would read it right away. The man wanted to know who this Joe was, since his highness had written him letters himself. A harsh voice was heard, resenting Melinda, who had just been fed fresh grass. The messenger approached him. The protagonist turned around and greeted the visitor with a wide smile. His heart even beat more frequently. With a joyful hike, Joe flew up to the stranger and inquired what the stranger required. The character noticed how handsome the stable boy was and gave the letter written by his highness. The girl was instantly transformed, and when she opened it, she became despondent. She could not read. There was no one who could read it. So Joe turned to his uncle. The embarrassed man asked not to tell anyone because the others would think he was secretly reading the royal mail. Kim Jin-che promised not to cause any inconvenience. The prince was well aware that Joe liked him, but he needed to stop now because it was interfering greatly with his life. The girl couldn't wait to hear what was written in that letter, and he felt sorry for him. A few days after Joe was handed the letter from Kyle, the prince called Pal to make sure the mission was perfect. Even after all that, though, the protagonist prayed to God to let her see his highness again. She repeated several times how much she loved him. In that case, it already seemed like it would be better for him to keep her by his side. Though no way, having her anywhere near him would make his ears fall off. The new letter had to be delivered today. But before he left, Pal had to make sure Joe would forgive him. The man, on the other hand, apologized because he couldn't give such a letter to this child. The prince didn't understand why all of a sudden Benji offered his help, but it was only a letter, so there was no need to send it there. In that case, there was no one else to go. He still didn't understand why things had turned out this way. The knight was convinced that King Gingjia had a knack for charming people. Just by getting to know her, they would immediately side with her and believe her every word, wanting to meet her again and again. But what was the reason for this? In fact, it wasn't a letter Benji wished to pass on, but simply that he had missed Joe for a very long time. The man flushed at the thought and wanted to go there again. His highness had given the go-ahead. After a while, he called out to the protagonist and greeted her, reminding her to call him Mr. Benji, except there was no need to do so since there was no one standing around. Kim Jin-ja reminded her that her buddy had cut her hair off and in a moment abruptly switched to Melissa, who wasn't allowed to eat there. The knight noticed that she was used to the stable life, of course, for she had even developed muscles. The girl wondered what he thought about her hair. However, Benji blanched and turned away again. The protagonist didn't understand and repeated her question. The man mumbled that she should have worn a hat because freaks like that need to cover their faces. She tricked him by saying that the guy wasn't popular with the girls because no one would like to hear that. Finally, Kim Jin-ja asked why the guy had come to see her. Benji had brought her a letter. He was both a knight and his highness's right hand, but it was a pity to waste such talent on simply delivering a letter. The man thanked her for her compliments, but none of the servants wanted to go to the stables. The girl didn't believe it, and her mate wondered why. Maybe it was because Pal and Tommy had come by not long ago and brought her food in a blanket. They were worried that Joe would freeze at night, and so they had fun together yesterday too. People were crying over him, feeding him. Benji began to ponder. The workers had come for their personal business, but they didn't didn't want to carry the letter to her, so he was the one who was the problem. And then Kim Jinja asked his buddy to read the letter to her, citing his inability to do so. The man remembered it, but opened it anyway. The prince asked the girl to stop thinking about him because he had a terrible headache. The protagonist also all came out curious about the content of the letter. Moreover, she hated people who delayed so long to read it. It was now clear to him that it was the same as the others here. His Highness was tired, so he asked her to stop thinking about him so much. Kim Jinja was horrified. After all, she was doing this out of habit. Banji, on the other hand, was interested in what she was talking about. The protagonist said that in her next life, she wanted to become Kyle's lips because as an upper lip, she would be able to kiss the lower lip. And being born a lower lip, she could kiss the upper lip. Knight sarcastically replied that it was still quite restrained. The girl also shared that she sent her messages from the bottom of her heart and they were written the way they really were. She trembled every time she sent them. His Highness seemed to hear even the most salacious things. It was a pity for him. Suddenly, someone's scream was heard. It was Deep. If the protagonist lost it, she would be slaughtered. Benji tried to stop her when she was already running fast. It was useless to chase after a fleeing horse. Kim Jinja demanded that the horse stop in turn. The horse turned around and rushed towards Joe. The animal's figure loomed over him, blocking the sun's path. Benji was really scared for her. And so was she. She couldn't save Kyle now either. The hoof was almost close to her face, and at that moment the prince felt something. He even had a questioning look on his face. Suddenly something had happened. King Ginjia was covered by someone else's body, and Deep was calmly moving around the lawn. Banji was lying on top of his buddy. He managed to push her away. The man was afraid for her. Because she was on the verge of death, how could one just stand there? The girl freaked out too, as she was equally panicked herself. Something could have happened to her, except, in her opinion, it was none of his business. The prince would have to be careful until the protagonist's identity was revealed. She shouldn't have done anything thoughtless, except it was Deep who almost knocked her down. That was exactly why he had asked. The girl rose to her feet and leaned sharply to the side, falling on top of the knight. The man stammered and stiffened. At this moment, Kyle stood by the tree and watched this scene. Kim Jinja had scared Benji, for which she apologized. Pal called out to his highness and informed him that her Imperial Majesty was looking for him. The man quickly turned around, and after a short while, he was there. A woman with bright blue eyes asked him to sit down. She asked if Kyle remembered Bernard Hesting. The answer was yes. They had met him several times as children. He was a feudal lord who owned the Hesting lands. Sir Bernard had been made a duke, which meant it would be good to visit him. The man fearfully made the assumption that Lorraine had passed away. She had lived a long life. The heroine had insisted that the Hesting lands passed to Kyle, but they were still in the wrong hands. Instead of Lorraine, the next Lord and Duke of Hestain was the unknown Bernard, so His Highness needed to make sure to go and meet him in person. It was necessary to get confirmation as to whether or not he was his loyal subject. This meant that Kyle would be the first to win him over. Hestain joined the Veloists. Her Imperial Majesty had already received his reply. This was going to be a demonstration. It amused her greatly when she thought of how the prince would return, cleaning up the Hestain that the past emperor had failed to keep. Except it always seemed to the man that everyone always talked as if the Imperial family's affairs were someone else's. Of course, if Kyle became emperor, Sir Bernard would have to be given at least some sort of ministerial post. But he was a Bilthian. His mother was a Veloist, and he was. Her Imperial Majesty gave him a shock. The man remembered calling out to her and talking about how if she stopped him, Jimenez would probably kill him. He needed help. She was the queen after all. But the woman just watched the crying child in silence. He was the son of Velois and Biltines. But who did Kyle think he was within the walls of this palace? So many families supported them, and the number would grow. Only they didn't have time to act leisurely, picking the right methods. Her son, that is, the prince, was to become emperor. Benji was angry that the girl had hurt herself by her own stupidity after all. It was frustrating for her that he was talking to the injured woman in that particular tone of voice. The man seemed to like the way the situation was coming out, but it still gave him some trouble. After sitting the girl down, he began to examine her leg. This made her nervous. After all, someone could see them. If she was afraid of this happening, she should have stopped calling the knight by name. Mentally, King Ginjia was worried that she smelled, but the man only noticed how badly swollen it was. The ankle was simply gigantic in size. Of course, she had pulled it badly after all. In all likelihood, it turned out that way at that moment. The expression on Benji's face was getting strange. The stable was indeed a dangerous place. It was only today that this happened. Nothing had happened before, except she couldn't be sure that it wouldn't happen from now on. The knight had been so proper today. He indicated for King Gingjia to apply the bandage firmly and not to overexert herself. It seemed like the bones were intact, so it should heal soon. She examined her ankle and gave an affirmative answer, but she had horses to feed. The man asked her to just sit there. he would do it himself. The staff had been watching the hay for his horse during training, so he would definitely do well. The main character, on the other hand, only hurt herself, so at least today she could afford to just rest. Apparently, Benji was really worried about her, and it made her laugh. She was almost laughing already, because the man was being kind and not nagging, of course. It seemed like Kim Jin-ishie was much younger, but she was actually Nuna in age, so it was okay to call her that. The main character wasn't interested in anyone but Kyle, so she was completely oblivious to the sympathy from others. The guy called her name Joe loudly, explaining that he couldn't leave his workplace for long, so he had to go. The man would try to come to her again tomorrow, so she could take it easy and let herself rest. The girl called him a bore who acted like an old grandfather, so he hit her sharply on the head, even though he said he tapped her lightly. Benji didn't like it when she talked nonsense. She needed to eat well and recover soon. In King Gingjia's eyes, this person had also hurt himself somewhere, as he was acting rather strange. Before finally leaving, the knight looked around a few times. After working for a while, the girl realized that she had indeed injured herself. It was such bad luck, and her ankle hurt unrealistically with any movement. It hurt so much she missed Kyle. She should have been reborn and become a mirror in his room. Then she'd be lucky to see him every day. Suddenly, Kim Jin-ja compared herself to a pervert. Albeit briefly, she shrugged off the thought because the man hadn't heard any of that anyway. Benji had done all the work, and she would be able to sleep early tonight. In this twilight, it was possible to see the pursuer. The girl woke up suddenly because someone was knocking on the door. She assumed it was Rick. Although that character was supposed to be back tomorrow, it was getting scary. The situation was getting worse. It could have been a burglar or a murderer. If only her legs were okay, she would have caught him by now and given him to the horses to eat. But the pain was only getting worse. Whoever it was, King Ginja missed Kyle even more. The shadow abruptly turned around and started moving towards the main character. How on earth could he know that she was exactly there? The girl had said so herself, hadn't she? Said she missed him. The man recalled his mother's words that she could kill him if he was going to interfere with her. Kyle agreed with her. After all, if it wasn't for her, he was no longer in this world. Just like his other siblings, His Highness suddenly remembered his childhood. His 3-year-old half-brother Andrew had died after drowning in a pond. He was there with the servants, so such a death seemed impossible, and the protagonist begged for an investigation. But no one listened to him. When the prince came to the emperor, he spoke to him in his crowning detached tone. He went back and waited for the man to call for him, but the man never did until just before Andrew's funeral. Having lost her son, the empress had committed suicide. The emperor, for his part, quickly filled in all the empty cells with other puzzles, and the next year, as Jimenez slowly died after drinking poison, Kyle found his mom. He was small and innocent, and she was the one who stood up for him. But all the woman did was ask who Kyle was. Of course, the boy didn't understand, but the woman insisted he think hard. Kyle de Bilthian, the emperor's son. According to her, he was the first prince in line to the throne, so there was no problem with Jimenez being dead. The sadness was supposed to pass with time, but fame would give him much more pleasure. Then he failed to ask her something, to ask if she had put poison in Jimenez's food. The girl died a week later, and the funeral was held in the imperial palace according to all the rules and laws. Everything was repeated exactly the same. No one but her mother was sad. Suddenly, a thought crossed his mind. Would his parent be sad when he died? No. If he couldn't live the life befitting a crown prince and was useless, she couldn't kill him, could she? If only he had red eyes. Would they love him? At least a little more sincerely. Looking at it that way, Princess Jimenez and Prince Kyle were getting along quite well. He seemed to be the one who was born to become emperor, even if the protagonist didn't want it. To his mother and the others, Ob was just a tool. He shouldn't have immersed himself in memories after all. It wasn't befitting of a future emperor. That was right. If a man didn't become one, there would be no one left to love him. Suddenly a girl's voice was heard. She was saying how much pain she felt. So much pain that she missed Kyle. And now she wished she could be reborn as a mirror, because then she would be able to see him every day. The man was embarrassed. At least there was at least one person in this world who would love him, even if he didn't become emperor. And so they met. Every time she met Prince King Ginja, she seemed very surprised. The girl couldn't believe that he was real. But why was he here at a time like this? The man mumbled that he heard her being sick. Yes, because of him. Her heart ached. Even on such a dark night, she could only see him so clearly. Could it have been a hallucination? Kyle was right in front of her, but the heroine kept thinking. He noticed how she'd grown her hair. It was Benji's work, since Mrs. Tully said that she didn't have a job for a girl who couldn't read. It occurred to her to change into a guy. But Kin Jinja didn't expect to be cut so much. The prince suddenly guessed. The knight didn't seem to have said anything about it, only how she had been reading the letters all this time. Of course she had help, and that was the reason for the incredibly stiff scones, the dried up pink, the servants who looked at him very coldly for some reason. The girl thought them good people. Again her ankle ached. Kim Jin-ja explained that she had sprained it recently. The protagonist apologized for the letters. But suddenly, the man gets down on one knee and decided to look at her leg. She didn't understand what Kyle was saying to her. And her feet must have smelled. She must have said all that out of embarrassment. It didn't matter to him. King Ginja's heart was literally flying out. From above, he seemed even 20 times more handsome. If she was taller than His Highness, she would be able to always look at him from this angle. I should have drank more milk as a child. Out loud, the man replied that people taller than him were rare. How ashamed she was that her voice conveyed even such nonsense to him. She should have hidden her thoughts somehow. After the protagonist changed into men, it began to seem like she was becoming even more brazen. It didn't matter how Kim Jin-ja looked, because she was still cute. His Highness emphasized that she had injured her ankle, not her head. The girl thought she was nice, but still Kyle was more beautiful in her eyes. He quickly turned away and offered to call a doctor from the palace, only she didn't agree, citing her status as an ordinary guy who worked in the stables. The prince mumbled that King Ginja was also his hostage, until they revealed who she was. So everything was fine now. Then again, he had said that again. Kyle wondered what had happened to her in the end. The protagonist explained that this afternoon, Diep suddenly got up on his haunches and started running away. The girl tried to catch him, and he, probably recognizing the one feeding him, rushed towards her as if he was going to pounce and kill her. That's why she asked to be rescued. People who feed don't lunge at people who want to kill. But anyway, it's a good thing it was only her ankle. She was saved by Benji. The knight grabbed her in time and threw her aside. The prince became sad and wondered if the two were really close. Kim Jin-chae noticed that unhappy and languid look, although it was midway between languid and sexy. He was starting to become immune to everything she was talking about. Did that mean the girl could go on? That wasn't what Kyle meant at all. He asked her to do it at least less often because it made him uncomfortable, especially when someone in his head started speculating about the golden mean while he was eating. The main character hadn't expected to hear it so often. She thought the man was picking up her thoughts from somewhere outside rather than feeling it in his head. It was LL true. And Kyle wasn't dreaming at all. When Kim Jin-ja asked what exactly it was, the man began to look away nervously. It wasn't important. The girl didn't hear and asked for a repeat. As it turned out, she said several times a day that Kyle was handsome. Now the protagonist was embarrassed too. That was exactly right. That was the real truth. Diep was his horse, so he was going to take charge. The heroine figured he was going to give it to someone. It didn't need to be done. Mostly Diep was unkind, but he could be friendly sometimes too. He clearly didn't deserve this. In fact, if the prince were to reduce the number of horses, in addition to feeling affectionate, his ranking in the palace could also be greatly reduced. How this ranking system pissed off Kim Jin-ja. The man agreed, but still decided to deal with everything himself. Diep was probably frustrated too, because the girl couldn't catch up with him since she didn't know how to ride a horse. For that simple and obvious reason, Kyle was going to come over at least once a day and teach her how to ride. The horses could get upset, so he would visit the stable. That was how he reasoned. Could it be that His Highness was doing this because of the main character, since he was worried about her getting hurt? The man was embarrassed for some reason, making him even cuter. He was just adorable from front to back. He was like candy. You wanted to put him in your mouth and lick him. Kyle heard everything, so he asked her to slow down and stop saying such embarrassing things. Kim Jin-ja's eyes glazed over. Stargazing had begun. While he was worried about her leg, the girl exclaimed for him to make a wish in time. At that moment, he remembered his sister, the greedy one who had approached Rick, demanding that he stop feeding her potatoes and instead replace her diet with meat. But the main character wished for Kyle to be happy, to enjoy the love he would receive from others in the most shameless way possible. No matter what, she wanted them to love each other. Suddenly, the man uttered that the stars were useless because they couldn't coexist together with the sun either. It was frustrating for King Ginja to hear such things about the stars. No matter how brightly the sun shone, it was the stars that people made wishes for. They were considered a symbol of hope. Kyle watched her for a long time before he turned away abruptly. Embarrassed, the girl assumed that he was cold or his eyes were sore from the strong wind. His Highness mumbled something quietly, so King Ginja asked him to repeat himself. The man wanted to see if she really liked him, which greatly angered her. It was starting to make her angry. Hadn't he been hearing about it for a whole month now? She asked him to look at her. The girl really wanted to make this poor guy happy, even if she couldn't change the future. At least he had to know that she loved him. At least he didn't have to feel lonely. That was what the main character kept thinking about. And now he was asking such rambling questions. Kyle was curious as to why his mate wasn't answering, and just looking at her just gave her goosebumps. Kim Jin-ja went silent. Really again. Suddenly, she mumbled what she was going to say without any intermediaries. Directly, to her, the prince was the best. He was the only one. Really the best. The old man's name was Pal. He was considered the most important of all of His Highness's servants. And lately, The prince had been behaving very strangely. When the guy called out the character, he asked what he thought of him. A man who is capable of shamelessly rejecting a little boy's heart. An unfortunate prince who suffered because of the emperor, empress, siblings, and even assassins. Cold-blooded. And Pal had a lot of things he would have liked to say, but because he was receiving a salary from His Highness, so, of course, he replied that the prince was perfect. Now Kyle was convinced that Pal thought so as well. As it turned out, the protagonist didn't think he was just handsome. Maybe he should have started washing his face with something like rose water, or tried styling his hair before bed. He was really that today. His Highness had started acting weird ever since the meteor shower a few days ago. He was lying on the floor when Pal saw him. A man was going somewhere so late at night. And without Benji, it became known that it was to the stables. That day, his face turned red all over, and since then, he continued to be like that. The old man asked what was the cause. Had something happened while he was at the stables? The stars were a symbol of hope. That's what he was thinking about. So His Highness asked Pal what he was thinking about as he looked at them. It seemed to the prince that he was talking about some nonsense. After apologizing, he was about to go to the stables, and the servants had found enough, so he should take a break. The old man assumed that Kyle was headed there because of Joe. It seemed to him that the little fellow had told His Highness that he was ugly, and so the man suddenly began to watch his appearance, except it was the opposite. The next day, Kim Jin-ja had already kicked hay with her foot. Her ankle had fully recovered, and she started doing physical work again. Every day, it was getting colder and colder. Speaking of changes, since the night Kyle had left the stables in a hurry, it began to be said that he had started visiting this place as if on a schedule. Whenever a girl saw him riding deep, she immediately got the urge to work. And of course, Benji. He kept popping into the stable to ask if her ankle was all right and if she had hurt herself again. The knight kept saying all the time that King Gingjia should have rested more, so why was she taking so much on? But now she didn't care about anything. The man snickered, recalling that she had talked about how much she liked His Highness. And yes, it was true. Normally, noble girls didn't brag about their power in front of a guy they liked. However, the protagonist was curious if she would starve to death if she lived like a noblewoman when she had no connections. Her charm lay in her survivability. Benji was confused, but realized what she was talking about. Suddenly, Kyle rode between them on horseback. He had somewhere to go, so he wouldn't have a chance to come to the stables for a while. Of course, when you're a prince, you're very busy all the time. The girl wondered where the man was going until she realized it was to Hestane. It had all happened too quickly. Kim Jin-ja had definitely seen it in the novel, but she couldn't recall it. It seemed to have been a glimpse of everything there, until suddenly it came to her. The girl asked what the place was famous for, and most famously Hestane was famous for its silk. This made the men think that the protagonist wanted something as a gift, but no, she didn't remember there being anything important related to silk in the novel. As it turned out, there was a rare type of ore that could not be removed from the area where it was mined. Orbsidal, a black and shining ore, was exactly the same color as his eyes. The name of these places was similar to the name of this ore. Out loud, King Gingjia tried to pronounce it correctly: Ori, Ora, Ori, Oral, Oraban. Both men seemed to understand what she was saying. Only if she wanted to call the prince Oraboni, it wouldn't work. The protagonist didn't understand why she would want to call His Highness her older brother. After all, where she came from, if a man was handsome, they called him Appa. That wasn't the point. Kyle had seen her try to say something similar, so he assumed. But right now, she needed to take good care of the horses. Benji should have gone with him. King Gingjia was slightly upset that the knight would leave her as well. It was natural to ride accompanied by the knight's guards. The prince noticed that these two seemed very close, so he didn't want to leave the two of them alone. At this moment, she was watching him intently. His Highness said so, but in fact, he was just embarrassed to ask her to come with him. Her intuition worked so well for her that in the company where she worked before, the main character got the nickname Kim Intuition, all because she could easily recognize people's true motives. Only the look on Kyle's face told a different story. It was time to do some trading, so they had to go. King Gingjia thought the prince was embarrassed, and she managed to hit right in the bullseye. She wished them a good trip and said goodbye. It had been a few days since His Highness and Benji had left. It was so empty. Aside from waiting for the prince to return, the protagonist had many other important things to do. Since she was extremely busy, time flowed quickly. But Kim Jin-jo couldn't do anything about the emptiness in her soul. Had the stables and fields always been this spacious? Suddenly, someone called out to the girl. Blocking out the sun, Joe seldom jumped up and wondered who the boy was. He also asked if the protagonist worked here or not. As it turned out, his brother had come to this place for something. If you take a closer look, his beauty is no joke. He has a great future ahead of him. A beautiful baby. After Kyle left, the servants started coming to Kim Jin-ja's place to chat. She had learned the names of almost everyone who worked here, so she could guess. Only the guy didn't give up so easily. Instead of saying, He wanted to ride a horse. The heroine was setting herself up to be patient. After all, she had the image of a fun-loving boy, so she should have been thinking about the handsome blonde boy right now. The boy repeated his words incessantly. They found themselves at the horses. Joe asked if his new friend knew how to ride. The answer was yes, which was good because the animals hadn't run in days, so he was getting worried. The girl inquired about his name. His name was Tio. The boy looked embarrassed and tilted his head slightly. She invited him inside, even though it smelled like manure. But if you got used to it, there was no problem at all. Kim Jin-jo introduced him to all the horses before the boy was curious about Joe himself. He introduced himself and remembered that he and Rick often joked and laughed. But was it okay to act like that with kids? Even though he was straightforward, he was still such a kid. Tio noticed that Joe had only recently worked here, explaining that everyone was forbidden to touch his hair. Suddenly, the servants were looking around for the young master, Theodore de Bilfior, 5th Prince, also known as the Under Prince. He is the younger brother of Kyle, born Priscilla. Since he was 5th in line, he was far down the line of succession, and more importantly, he was not red-eyed. His position in the palace was below the plinth, and he was even given such a derogatory nickname. The only person who showed any interest in him was Kyle. They chatted about the academy and classes. Even though Tio was small, he understood his situation. No matter how hard they tried, no one would notice anything. Even though those above Kyle in rank occasionally made fun of him, he never stopped learning, so his younger brother was fascinated by him. And then one day, His Highness was about to leave. From that moment on, there was no more room for Tio to be near his brother. The next day, he went away too, and then again, and then again. The boy had the feeling that he'd been abandoned. After all, when he left for Hestine, he didn't even come to say goodbye. One day, Tio heard from the servants that the main character visited the stables and did something there. Therefore, the guide decided that his brother liked horses because every time he went there, he seemed excited. How had he not noticed that? Theodore was determined to become a master rider, and so he went to the stables. At 8 in the morning, the prince came to the horses, certainly not Kim Jin-ja. It was firmly established here. The guy was about to saddle Rinji, but suddenly the girl hit him on the head. At first, she wanted the guy to correct his commanding tone because he couldn't talk to the elders like that. To her, it reminded her of talking to her boss who constantly told her off. Tio decided that there was someone else coming here besides him. If you looked at it that way, after he started showing up at the stables, the others stopped dropping by. On top of that, they couldn't even say hello to her. And lately, the 5th prince had been bullying the employees. This was becoming typical, and the servants were constantly on the prowl looking for him. Tio inquired about the meaning of the word boss. It was a boss she had worked with before, a bad man with no manners. The boy was a commoner, Joe thought, only it didn't matter to him, frozen in panic because he wanted to ride Rinji. He repeated the same thing several times until Kim Jin-ja accepted it, provided the prince didn't find out about it. The girl walked over to the horse and whispered in its ear about everything that was happening. There was a feeling that they had forgotten something important. At that moment, the man in the carriage turned to Dolores to admire the castle. When they go in tight, everyone who hated her would be extremely surprised. Right now, this was truly a new beginning. Therefore, Isaac should have kept his cool.